"You don't own me. If I want my ex, I'll go to her," he said. So I changed the locks. Good evening, Queen Flowers. Before we step into tonight's story, let's lower our heads together for a moment and be honest with the Lord about what we're carrying. Heavenly Father, we come to you tonight as women who have been underestimated, women who have been told, in ways loud and quiet, that they don't get a say in their own lives. Lord, you know every queen flower listening has stood somewhere, longing for a love that made her feel small instead of safe. Father, tonight we ask you for courage. Help every woman remember she doesn't have to beg to be chosen, because her worth has always been in you. Give her the strength to change what needs changing, the wisdom to set healthy boundaries, and the peace to trust that every door closed in self-respect makes room for something better. Lord, remind every woman that she belongs first to you. A heart broken by disappointment is not a heart defeated. It is a heart you are preparing to bloom again. Thank you for every lesson, every season of growth, and every new beginning. May everyone watching leave this story remembering they were never too much. They were simply waiting to grow in the right place. In your precious and powerful name we pray. Amen. The morning my marriage started ending, I was on my knees in the dirt, elbow deep in rose thorns. And I didn't know it yet. I was cutting back the lady banks that climbed the porch trellis, the one my grandmother Fern had planted the year I was born. And the fog was still sitting low over Lookout Mountain, the way it did most June mornings in Chattanooga, soft and gray and unhurried. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking at the recycling truck. My coffee was going cold on the porch step behind me. I remember all of it so clearly now, the way you remember the last ordinary hour before everything changes, even though at the time it felt like nothing at all. The house was Fern's before it was mine, a craftsman bungalow in St. Elmo with a deep porch and a garden that wrapped the whole lot. And I'd spent 4 years since her death making it mine without ever once wanting it to stop being hers. I kept her hydrangeas. I kept her stubborn old fig tree that never quite got enough sun. I kept the hand-painted sign by the back gate that said Fern's Ground. Go gently, because some things you don't improve, you just tend. I heard the screen door and didn't turn around. I knew the sound of Holt's boots on the porch boards better than I knew my own heartbeat some days. 3 years of marriage will do that to you. And I could tell from the weight of his steps that he'd already had his coffee standing at the kitchen counter instead of out here with me. "I've got the Bragg Avenue framing inspection at 8, he said. "Might run long." "Might," I agreed, not looking up. There used to be a version of this morning where he crouched down next to me first, asked what I was pruning and why. Let me explain more than he needed to know about deadheading, because he liked watching my hands work. That version of Holt had mostly gone quiet these last 8 months since his father died. The way a house goes quiet when somebody stops coming home to it, even though everybody's still living there. I told myself it was grief. Grief does that. It hollows a person out from the inside and leaves the shape of them standing in your kitchen, using your coffee mug, saying your name in a voice you don't quite recognize. His phone buzzed on the porch rail behind me. Twice, that specific double buzz of a text landing, while the screen was already lit from something else. I didn't mean to look. I want that on the record, for whatever it's worth to say it now. I wasn't hunting for anything that morning. But the phone was 6 inches from my elbow, and my eyes went where eyes go. "Marin, thank you for listening yesterday. I don't think I say that enough." I sat back on my heels. The name meant nothing to me and everything to me at the same time. The particular nothing, everything of a stranger's name, showing up somewhere it has no business being. "Who's Marin?" I asked, and I asked it easy, the way you'd ask about a client or a supplier, because I genuinely believed, for about 4 more seconds, that there was an easy answer coming. Holt didn't answer right away. He was looking at his phone, not the message, just the black rectangle of it, like it had betrayed him by existing in daylight. "Somebody from around town," he said finally. Nobody important. 4 seconds is nothing. 4 seconds is the time it takes to snip a dead bloom off a rose cane. But I had spent 3 years learning the difference between Holt's quiet and Holt's careful, and that pause had been careful. I filed it away the way I file away a plant that isn't thriving, not panicking yet, just noting the yellow at the edge of the leaf. Nobody important gets a good morning text before 7, I said. And I smiled when I said it, because I still believed that morning that a smile could make a hard question land soft, Laurel. Just my name flat, a door easing shut. I've got the inspection. He came down the steps 2 at a time, kissed the air somewhere near my temple without actually landing on skin, and was in his truck before I'd finished standing up. I watched him back out of the driveway too fast, the way he'd been driving since Merle died, like there was somewhere he needed to be and nowhere he wanted to arrive. I want to tell you, I knew right then. I didn't. What I knew was smaller and stranger than that. I knew that my chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the wrist-deep thorns, and that some part of me, some old animal part, that had nothing to do with reasoning, had already started keeping score. 4 years earlier, this same porch had been where Holt Chastain first made me laugh so hard I cried 3 days after we buried Fern, when his crew was reframing the Merrick's garage next door, and he'd walked over uninvited with a foil pan of his mother's chicken and dumplings because, he said, nobody grieves well on an empty stomach. I hadn't asked him to stay. He'd stayed anyway, sitting on the top step with me until the streetlights came on, not filling the silence with anything, just being a warm, solid weight beside me while I fell apart. I married that man 11 months later in this same garden, under an arbor his own hands had built, and I had never once doubted, not for a single hour of our courtship, that I was loved by someone who showed up. I didn't know yet that showing up and staying were 2 different promises. I was about to learn it the hard way. His father, Merle Chastain, had built Chastain & Sons Construction up from a single flatbed truck and a handshake reputation. And when he died of a heart attack on a job site 8 months ago, the & Sons part of that sign became Holt's problem to carry alone, since his sister Shay had never wanted the business and nobody had ever seriously asked her to. I'd watched my husband go from a man who whistled while he worked to a man who answered his phone like it might be bad news every single time, because for 1 whole year of his life, it kept being bad news. I'd told myself that whatever was closing off in him would open back up eventually. Grief has a season, I believed. I just hadn't asked myself what happened if the season never ended, or what a man does with all that unspent sorrow when he can't find anywhere safe to set it down. By 9, I'd showered and dressed and driven the 12 minutes to my studio on Cherokee Boulevard, the little converted garage behind a florist's shop that housed Fern & Stone, the design firm I'd built 1 client garden at a time since I was 28. My business partner in everything but paperwork, Zora Cantu, was already at the drafting table when I walked in, a coffee waiting for me exactly the way I liked it, and a look on her face that told me she'd heard something in my voice through the phone an hour ago that I hadn't meant to let slip. "You're doing the thing," she said, without looking up from the bid she was marking up. "The thing where you go quiet and pretend you're fine." "I am fine." "Uh-huh." She capped her pen. "Fine people don't text me at 6:40 in the morning asking whether I've ever heard the name Marin. I hadn't even realized I'd sent that text. I looked down at my own phone like it belonged to somebody else. "It's probably nothing," I said. "Probably," Zora agreed, in the exact tone of a woman who did not believe that for 1 single second, and reached over to squeeze my hand once before she went back to her drafting. Like she already knew I was going to need both hands free for whatever was coming. The city of Chattanooga had put out a request for proposals that week for the redesign of Willow Run Park down along the river. 4 acres of public green space that would be the biggest commission of my career if I landed it. And I spent the rest of that morning telling myself that was the only thing worth thinking hard about. I pinned the site survey to the corkboard above my table, 4 acres of scrubby riverbank I could already see transformed in my head. Native grasses and a canopy walk and a children's garden shaped like a bend in the river itself. This was the work I was good at. This was the part of my life I had built with my own 2 hands and nobody else's money. And some stubborn part of me clung to it that morning the way you'd cling to a railing on a boat that had just started to rock. I did not think about Marin. I thought about Marin so hard that by lunch I had learned nothing new and lost an entire morning anyway, sketching the same curve of pathway 4 times without once getting it right. You want to talk about it? Or you want to keep pretending that path is the problem? Zora said around 1 o'clock, sliding a sandwich onto the corner of my desk without being asked. I want to keep pretending, I admitted. Okay. She sat down across from me and unwrapped her own lunch like she had nowhere else to be, which was, I would come to understand over the following months, one of the truest kindnesses Zora Cantu knew how to offer. But for what it's worth, Laurel Brennan, you've never once in 6 years drawn the same bad line 4 times over nothing. I didn't have an answer for that. I just kept drawing, and some quiet, traitorous part of me had already started waiting for Holt's truck to pull back into our driveway that evening, already bracing for whatever was written on his face when it did. Chapter 2. Ghosts We Don't Talk About. I want to be honest about what I did that night, because the rest of this story only makes sense if I am. Holt came home late, later than the inspection should have run, smelling like sawdust and somebody else's cigarette smoke. And he ate the plate I'd kept warm for him without much conversation and fell asleep on the couch before the second half of a basketball game he wasn't even watching. I sat beside him for a while, watching the blue light of the television move across his face, trying to find my husband in there somewhere underneath all that exhaustion. Then I took my laptop out to the porch and I looked up the name Marine. I'm not proud of it. I don't think there's a version of this where I'd tell you I felt good doing it, hunting for a stranger's face in the dark, like some kind of detective in a story I never asked to be part of. But I'd spent the whole afternoon with that name, sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. And I have never in my life been the kind of woman who could leave a stone unturned, just because looking under it might hurt. It didn't take long. Chattanooga isn't a small town, but it isn't a large one either, and everybody who grew up here is still tangled up with everybody else in ways that outlast decades. Marin Kearney, a handful of mutual connections, most of them people I recognized from Holt's side of the family. A profile picture from a wedding 4 years back, and then nothing current at all. The specific kind of silence that usually means somebody's gone through something they don't want documented. I found what I was looking for in an old tagged photo instead. 7 years deep in somebody else's page, a homecoming dance, half the football team in rented tuxedos, and there in the middle of it, 17 years old and laughing at something off camera, was Holt. His arm was around a girl with dark hair and a gap-toothed grin, who the caption named as Marin High School. It had been high school. I sat with that a long time. High school sweethearts are supposed to be harmless, the kind of thing you laugh about at your own wedding, some old flame you toast instead of fear. But I kept scrolling backward through the wreckage of both their pages, piecing together a timeline the way you'd piece together a fossil. And what I found instead was a marriage of Marins that had ended, according to a single terse post 8 months back, and a return to Chattanooga that lined up, give or take a week. With the same terrible stretch of time when we buried Merle. She'd have known him, I realized. His family and hers went back that far. She'd have been at the funeral. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to Holt and listened to him breathe. Slow and even, a man untroubled enough to actually rest. And I thought about grief, and about how it can make a person reach backward for anything solid. Any hand that used to fit theirs before the world got so complicated. I thought about how kind that could look from the outside. 2 old friends comforting each other. I thought about how a thing could be kind and still be a betrayal, both at once, if nobody ever said its name out loud. The next morning I told myself I'd imagined the worst of it. That's what I do, I think. I build the whole disaster in my head so thoroughly that by the time I go looking for evidence, I've almost convinced myself I won't find any. I went to the studio. I finished the Willow Run Pathway sketch. I came home and made dinner and didn't mention the name Marin. And Holt didn't offer it either. And for 3 days we lived like that. 2 people tiptoeing around a hole in the floor that only one of us had actually seen. It was the credit card statement that broke the tiptoeing. I handled our finances, had since the beginning of our marriage, mostly because Holt found paperwork about as appealing as a root canal, and I'd always been the one who liked things in tidy columns. The statement came the way it always did, a plain envelope in the mailbox between a seed catalogue and a water bill, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and went down the list the way I did every month. Half out of habit and half because it was the one part of my day that still felt entirely under my control. Boar farm table. $164, the Tuesday 2 weeks back. I remembered that Tuesday specifically, because it was the night Holt had texted me at 6 that he'd be late. Said he was walking a client through a change order on the Bragg Avenue job and didn't want to rush it. I'd eaten alone. I'd fallen asleep before he got home. Bar farm table wasn't a place you went to walk a client through paperwork. It was a place you went for dinner, candlelight, the kind of small farm-to-table restaurant on the North Shore where we'd had our own third date, back when he was still learning the particular sound of my laugh, and I was still learning that his hands shook a little when he was nervous, which had felt, at the time, like the most beautiful thing I'd ever noticed about another human being. $164 is not a solo dinner. Not at Bauer. I sat very still for a long moment, the statement flat on the table under my palm, like I could hold it down and keep it from being true. Then I did the thing I'm least proud of in this whole story. Though I would come to understand later that it was also the thing that saved me. I got out a legal pad, and I started writing down dates, every late night for the last 2 months. Every text that said, "Don't wait up." Every Saturday, he'd claimed a job site emergency that never seemed to have a name. I laid it all out in my own careful handwriting, the same steady hand I used for garden plans, because some part of me had already understood that if I was going to survive whatever was coming, I would need it written down in ink, not just carried around loose and aching in my chest, where anyone, including me, could talk me out of believing it. I called my mother the next afternoon, ostensibly about nothing, a habit we'd kept up every week since my father passed, and left her alone in the house I grew up in over in Oltewa. Nadine Brennan had never once in her life let me get away with ostensibly. "You called to tell me about the park bid," she said, "and you've been talking for 6 minutes about mulch." What's wrong? I hadn't meant to tell her. It came out anyway, in pieces, the text, the photo, the restaurant charge. And my mother went quiet on the other end of the line in a way that frightened me more than if she'd gasped. "Have you asked him outright?" she finally said. "Not yet, Laurel." Her voice was gentle, but there was iron underneath it, the same iron I'd inherited without ever quite meaning to. "Your grandmother used to tell me that a woman who's afraid of the answer already knows what it is. She wasn't always right about everything, God rest her, but she was right about that. I don't want to blow up my marriage over a high school photograph, Mama. Nobody's asking you to blow up anything. I'm asking you to stop doing his lying for him by staying quiet." She let that sit a moment. "You are allowed to ask a simple question and expect a truthful answer. That's not the same thing as starting a war. I didn't have a response for that. So I told her I loved her and got off the phone before she could hear my voice do the thing it did when I was trying not to cry. And I sat on the porch step where Holt used to sit with me some mornings, back when mornings still had him in them all the way, and I thought about how right she was and how much I didn't want her to be. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself I was waiting for more proof, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some frightened, hopeful part of me was still waiting for an explanation that would make all of it make sense. A client dinner I didn't know about, A business partner named Marin, who happened to share a first name with a ghost from his childhood. Anything at all that would let me put the legal pad away and go back to believing I lived in an ordinary house with an ordinary marriage in it. That part of me stayed up long after Holt had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the porch light off and the crickets going outside the window, running one finger down a list of dates that told a story I already knew the shape of and simply hadn't found the courage yet to read aloud. Chapter 3. What Shay Knew. Marilyn Chastain had kept up the family's Sunday dinners even after Merle died, maybe especially after Merle died. The way some people hold a ritual tighter the moment it becomes the only thing standing between them and an empty table. I'd been going for 3 years, first as the girlfriend nobody was sure would last, then as the daughter-in-law who brought the cornbread because Marilyn had declared mine better than her own, which from Marilyn Chastain was as close to a wedding toast as she gave. That Sunday I almost didn't go. Holt had a job site walkthrough that ran long, which might have been true, might not have been. I'd stopped being able to tell the difference and hated myself a little for it. And I drove out to Marilyn's alone with a pan of cornbread balanced on the passenger seat and a stomach full of dread I couldn't name yet. Marilyn's house sat on a quiet street in Riverview with a carport instead of a garage, and a porch swing Merle had hung himself the summer before he died. And walking up to that door always felt like walking backward a little into a slower, kinder decade. She met me at the screen door in her apron, flower on her wrist, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like rosemary and Jergens lotion. The same hug she'd been giving me since the first Sunday Holt brought me home. "There's my girl," she said. "Lord, you're thin. Is that boy feeding you?" "I'm feeding myself just fine, Marilyn." She took the cornbread out of my hands like she didn't quite trust anyone else to carry it properly. "Get on in the kitchen." Shay's setting the table and doing a poor job, pretending she isn't dying to hear about the park contract. Shay was already there when I walked in, setting the table the way she'd set tables in that kitchen her whole life, quick and unfussy. A woman built along the same steady lines as her brother, but without whatever had gone hollow in him these last months. "You look tired," she said by way of hello. "Long week." "Well, at least Holt's got somebody to lean on right now, with everything." She set down the last fork and didn't look up. "I know it's not the same as her being back permanently, but I think it's done him good, honestly. Getting to talk to somebody who actually remembers Daddy from before, when he was young, and the business was young too. God knows he doesn't talk to me about any of it. The room did something strange then, tilted very slightly, the way a room does right before you understand you're about to fall down in it." "Talk to who, Shay?" She looked up at that, and I watched her face do the arithmetic a half-second too late. Watched her realize what she'd assumed I already knew and clearly did not. "Marin," she said, "careful now, the damage already done." "Marin Kearney. She's been back since the funeral, really. I just figured since y'all are close that he'd have mentioned—" "We're not close," I said. "I've never met her." Shay set down the last of the silverware very gently, like the table itself might crack if she moved too fast. "Laurel, I didn't mean to—" "I know you didn't, and I did know it." Shay Chastain had never had an unkind bone in her whole body, and watching her realize what she'd just handed me was almost worse than the information itself, because I could see exactly how much it was going to cost her to have been the one who said it out loud. "Tell me, please. However bad it is, I need you to just tell me." So she did, quietly, while her mother clattered pots 2 rooms away and had no idea what was unfolding at her own dinner table. Marin and Holt had dated all through high school, the real thing. The kind of young love that people in this town still brought up at reunions 20 years later. They'd broken it off at 22, not from any falling out, but because Marin's mother had gotten sick and Marin had to leave for Ohio to care for her, and Holt, only 22 himself and terrified the way young men are terrified of things they can't fix, hadn't asked her to stay and hadn't gone with her either. He'd let her go. He'd regretted it, Shay said, for years, in the quiet way men regret things they never say out loud. Marin's mother had died 14 months ago. Her own marriage had ended not long after, quietly, no scandal to it. Just two people who'd married too young and run out of reasons to stay. She'd come back to Chattanooga for Merle's funeral, because the two families had always been close. The Kearneys and the Chastains, casseroles passed back and forth across 3 decades. And she and Holt had found each other again in the receiving line at the funeral home. Two people burying different things at the same time and recognizing the particular shape of each other's grief. He cried at Daddy's funeral, Shay said, which I hadn't seen him do since we were kids. Marin was the one standing next to him when he did it. I wasn't. I was seating the great-aunts. She said it without bitterness, just fact. But I understood then that Shay had her own small grief tangled up in all of this too. The grief of being the sibling who handles the logistics while somebody else gets to hold your brother's heart. I don't think it's what you're imagining, Shay said. I really don't. I think it's just two sad people who used to know each other. That's usually how it starts, I said. And I didn't recognize my own voice when I said it. Flat and far away, like it belonged to somebody standing outside the conversation instead of inside it. I don't remember much of the dinner after that. I remember eating cornbread I couldn't taste. I remember Marilyn asking about the Willow Run bid and me answering in complete sentences that meant nothing, my mouth working independently of the rest of me, while the rest of me sat somewhere behind my own eyes, watching myself function. I remember hugging Shay goodbye at the door and feeling her hold on a half-second longer than usual. An apology neither of us said out loud. I drove home the long way along the river, past Coolidge Park, where the carousel lights were just coming on for the evening. Families out walking the Riverwalk with ice cream cones. An entire ordinary world, going on exactly as it always had, while mine quietly came apart at the seams. I pulled the car over once, at the overlook near the Walnut Street Bridge, and sat there with my hands on the wheel until they stopped shaking. I thought about our wedding, oddly, sitting there at that overlook. I thought about Holt building the arbor in Fern's garden with his own hands, measuring twice the way his father had taught him, sanding every edge smooth so I wouldn't catch a splinter on my dress. I thought about the version of him that had existed before grief hollowed him out. And I made myself hold both versions in my mind at once. The man who built me an arbor, and the man who was, at this very moment, driving home from wherever he'd actually been that evening. I owed him the truth of both. I owed myself the truth of both, too. I rehearsed the words the whole way home. I am not going to yell. I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I expect a truthful answer. The way my mother had said it, iron under gentle. I practiced it in the rearview mirror like a fool, watching my own mouth shape the sentence, trying to find a version of my face that could say it without breaking. By the time I turned onto our street, the sun had gone all the way down, and the porch light was the only thing burning. The one I always left on for him, a small yellow square of welcome I'd been, leaving on faithfully for 3 years without ever once imagining I'd stand underneath it and ask my husband whether he still loved somebody else. Was still sitting in the driveway, engine off, hands finally steady. When I saw his headlights turn the corner 2 blocks down, I got out of the car. I stood on the walkway between the hydrangeas Fern had planted 40 years ago, and I watched his truck slow and turn and come to a stop behind mine. And I understood, with a strange and total calm, that whatever was about to happen on this walkway was going to be the line between the marriage I'd had and whatever came next. The truck door opened. Holt stepped out into the porch light, and for just a moment, before either of us said a single word, I watched him see my face and understand that I already knew. Neither of us moved. The cicadas were loud in the oaks overhead, and somewhere down the street a screen door slapped shut, and my husband stood there in the yellow porch light with his keys still in his hand, looking at me the way a man looks at a door he already knows is about to close. Chapter 4. You Don't Own Me. He came around the front of the truck slowly, like a man walking towards something he already knew was going to hurt, and for one strange, Suspended second, I saw him the way I'd seen him that very first night on this porch. 28 years old and holding a foil pan of his mother's chicken and dumplings, gentle enough to sit with a grieving stranger until the streetlights came on. I wanted so badly to reach for that man. I made myself stand still instead. "Where were you tonight?" I said. Not a question. I'd promised myself a question gentle, my mother's iron wrapped in velvet. And instead what came out was flat and hard. Because, looking at his face in that porch light, I understood. I already had my answer and didn't need to ask for it. Politely, walking the Bragg Avenue, framing. He didn't quite meet my eyes when he said it. Try. Again, something shifted in his jaw. "Laurel, bar farm table," I said. "2 weeks ago Tuesday, $164, Holt, on a night you told me you were at a job site. I know about Marin. I know she's back. I know she was standing next to you at your daddy's funeral. And I know you didn't think I needed to know any of that. And I want you to explain to me right now why my own husband thought I didn't deserve the truth in my own house." The porch light hummed above us. A moth kept hitting the glass. Over and over, that small, frantic sound, the only thing filling the silence while my husband decided what kind of man he was. "Going to be in the next 10 seconds. It's not what you think," he said. "Then tell me what It's Zeke. She lost her mother. I lost my daddy. We've been talking, that's all. 2 people who understand something nobody else around us understands right now." His voice was rising. Not at me exactly, more like at the whole situation. Like he could argue his way out of a truth by getting loud enough. "You want me to apologize for having one person in this world I can talk to without you watching my face, for signs of whether I'm doing grief right? I have never once watched your face for signs of anything except whether you were still in there," I said, and my own voice cracked on the last word, the first crack of the whole conversation, and I hated it. "I have given you 8 months, Holt. 8 months of coming second to a version of you I don't recognize, and I never once complained because I told myself grief takes time. But I did not know I was competing with somebody. Nobody told me there was a race. There's no race." He dragged a hand down his face. "God, Laurel, it's not like that. Then what's it like? Use your own words. Don't tell me what it isn't. Tell me what it is." He was quiet for a long moment. And for that moment I let myself hope, foolishly, that he was about to say something honest enough to save us both. "It's the only thing that's felt like breathing in 8 months, he said instead. "Being with her. Not Laurel, I'm not sleeping with her, if that's what you're asking. I swear to you on my daddy's grave, I am not doing that. But when I'm with her, I don't have to be the man holding up the whole family and the whole business and pretending I'm fine every single day. I can just be a person who's sad. She lets me be sad. Nobody else in my life lets me be sad, including you. And I don't know if that's your fault or mine, but I know I need it. And I'm not ready to give it up just because you found a receipt. Just because you found a receipt. As if the receipt were the offense, instead of the 8 months of dinners eaten alone underneath it. Then let me be the one who lets you be sad," I said. "I'm right here, Holt. I have been right here every single night for 8 months, waiting for you to let me in, instead of some woman you haven't seen in 12 years. Why is it easier to be sad in front of her than in front of me? Because you look at me like you're waiting for me to be okay again," he said. And for a second there was something almost pleading in it. Something that might have cracked the whole night open differently if either of us had known how to catch it. "Every time I walk in this house, you've got that hope on your face. Like today's the day the old Holt comes back, and I can't carry that on top of everything else. She doesn't need me to get better. She just lets me be exactly this broken. So don't give it up," I said very quietly, my own voice shaking now despite everything I'd rehearsed in the rearview mirror. "Just tell me honestly right now, standing in this yard, that you understand what it does to your wife to learn, second-hand from your sister, that you've been rebuilding your life with someone else's comfort instead of mine. You don't own me," he said. The words landed like something physical, like he'd reached out and put a hand flat against my chest and shoved. I actually took a half step back on the walkway, my heel catching the edge of Fern's old brick border. "If I want to see her," he went on, "quieter now, but somehow worse for the quiet. If I want to sit with somebody who doesn't need me to perform being fine, I'll go to her. That's not you deciding. That's not a rule you get to set. I married you, Laurel. I didn't sign myself over to you. I stood very still in my own front yard and looked at my husband, this man who had built me an arbor with his own 2 careful hands, and I understood in the space of that one sentence. The grief had not simply hollowed him out. It had made him cruel in a way I don't think he even recognized in himself, cruel in the specific, surgical way of a person who has found the one sentence that will hurt you most and said it anyway, because saying it felt, in that moment, like power. "Okay," I said. He blinked, thrown by how calm I sounded. I was thrown by it too. Some part of me had gone very still and very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "Okay?" He repeated. "I'm not going to stand in my own yard and beg you not to go see her." "You're right. I don't own you." I made myself breathe once, slow. "But I'm not spending tonight in a house with a man who just told me my hurt doesn't get a vote. Go to your mother's or a motel. I don't care which. I need you to not be here tonight. Laurel, come on. I'm asking you to leave." "Holt, I have never once asked you for that in 3 years of marriage. So I'd appreciate you not making me ask twice." He looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been regret already starting its slow climb up through the anger. But it hadn't climbed far enough yet to change anything. He got back in his truck. I stood on the walkway and watched his taillights disappear around the same corner his headlights had come from 10 minutes earlier. And then I was alone in my own front yard, with the moth still beating itself against the porch light, and I let myself cry exactly as hard and as long as I needed to, standing right there in the grass, before I let myself go inside. The house was too quiet once I was in it. I wandered from room to room the way you do after a death, touching things, needing to confirm they were still solid. In the front hall closet, reaching for a blanket I didn't even need, my hand found instead the old accordion file where I kept Fern's papers, the ones I'd never quite gotten around to sorting after she died. And something made me pull it down and sit with it on the living room floor. The deed was near the top. Fern Brennan, sole owner, and beneath that 4 years old now. The recorded transfer into my name, and my name alone. Filed the month after her funeral, long before Holt and I had married. Long before this house had ever belonged to anybody but the women of my family. I sat on the floor with that piece of paper in my lap for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. But I felt, for the first time all night, like I was standing on ground that was actually mine, and somewhere underneath the grief, something small and steady began to make up its mind. Outside, the moth finally gave up on the porch light and flew off into the dark towards something else. I sat there a while longer, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do at night, and I thought about Fern, and what she would have said to me if she could see me sitting on her floor with her deed in my lap, and her granddaughter's marriage cracking open in the yard outside. I think she would have told me the same thing she used to tell me about the garden, back when I was young enough to think everything that wilted was dying instead of simply resting. Sometimes she'd say, "You don't lose a thing by cutting it back hard." Sometimes that's the only way anything gets the chance to grow new. Chapter 5, New Locks. I called the locksmith at 8 the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee, before I'd let myself think too hard about it and talk myself out of the one clear thought I'd woken up with. "I need all the exterior locks changed today," I told the woman who answered. "Front door, back door, the shed. Any particular reason or just routine?" She asked, not nosy, just making conversation the way people do. "It's my house," I said. "I'd just like it to feel that way again." She was there by 10, a brisk, efficient woman named Colleen, with a tool belt and no interest in my business beyond the make and model of my deadbolts. And I sat on the porch step and watched her work the way I used to watch Holt work. Methodical hands doing something I couldn't do myself. Except this time what she was building was a boundary instead of an arbor. I thought about Fern, while I watched. She taught me to garden the summer I turned 9, kneeling beside me in this same dirt, and the very first thing she'd ever taught me had nothing to do with planting and everything to do with cutting back. "You've got to prune the rose hard, Laurel Jean," she used to say, "right down to 3 or 4 good canes, even though it looks cruel doing it. If you let it keep every branch it ever grew, it spends all its strength holding up dead wood, and it never blooms the way it's meant to." I hadn't understood it as a 9-year-old. I understood it now, sitting on my own porch step, watching a stranger drill new hardware into a door I'd walked through 1,000 times as somebody's wife. I wasn't naive about what this meant. I knew changing the locks wasn't the same as ending a marriage, not by itself, but I also knew it was the truest sentence I could write, without saying a single word out loud. This house is mine. And you do not get to walk back into it as though last night didn't happen, simply because you've decided you're ready to. Zora called around noon, while Colleen was still working on the back door, and I put her on speaker and kept folding the laundry I'd been avoiding for a week, needing my hands busy while I talked. "You're really doing it," Zora said. It wasn't a question. "I'm really doing it." "Good." A pause. "I'm not going to pretend I'm neutral here, Laurel. I've watched you shrink for 8 months, trying to be small enough not to add to his grief. I'm glad something in this house is finally getting bigger instead of smaller. It feels like ending something. Maybe it's starting something instead. You don't know yet. Neither do I. But I know you didn't get up this morning and do this out of spite, and that matters. Spite burns out. This feels like you finally deciding you're worth defending." She was quiet a second. "Also, for the record, I brought coffee to the studio and you're not here, so I'm drinking both cups myself, and I regret nothing." I laughed. Actually laughed. The first real laugh in what felt like a very long week. And it startled me a little. How much room there still was inside me for something as ordinary as laughing at my best friend, while a stranger rebuilt the front door of my marriage 6 feet away. "Call me the second he shows up," Zora said before she hung up. "I mean it. Any hour. By 4 that afternoon it was done. I had 2 new keys on my ring, and a strange, hollow calm settled somewhere behind my ribs. The calm of a person who has finally stopped waiting for a storm and started building. The house that can survive one. Holt's truck came. Around the corner at 5:45, I was in the kitchen when I heard it slow. Heard the distinct crunch of his tires easing into the driveway, and I made myself stay right where I was, drying a mixing bowl that didn't need drying, my hands moving on their own while the rest of me listened. I heard his key turn in the front lock. I heard it turn and not catch, the specific grinding sound of metal that no longer fits. And I heard him try it twice more before I heard his footsteps come around to the back. And then that lock too, refusing him the same way. By the time he came around to the front porch, I was standing on the other side of the screen door, close enough to see his face clearly in the porch light. And I watched understanding move across it in stages, confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear, before it hardened, the way I'd learned it did lately, into anger. "You changed the locks," he said. "Not a question either, same as mine the night before." "I did. This is my house too." "Laurel, no," I said, and I kept my voice level. The same level I'd have used walking a client through a planting plan. "It's my house. It was my grandmother's, and then it was mine. And it's never once, in 3 years of marriage, been anything but mine on paper. Which I never made an issue of because I never imagined I'd need to. I'm not putting you out on the street, Holt. I'll help you find somewhere to stay tonight if you need it. But you don't get to stand in my grandmother's front yard and tell me I don't own myself, and then walk back through my front door like nothing happened." A curtain moved next door at the Merricks, just slightly, and I saw Holt clock it too. Saw the muscle in his jaw tighten at the thought of being watched. Some small, tired part of me almost softened at that. Almost wanted to spare him the audience before I remembered he hadn't spared me anything at all, standing in this same yard less than 24 hours ago. "So that's it?" 14 years, and a woman I haven't seen since high school shows up at my father's funeral, and you're just done. I'm not done, I said, and it surprised me how true it felt saying it. I'm not filing anything tonight, Holt. I'm not calling a lawyer tonight. I'm telling you that the man who stood in this yard last night and told me I don't get a vote in whether my own marriage survives does not also get a key to my house while he figures out what he wants. Those are two different things. You keep acting like I'm choosing an ending. I'm choosing a boundary. There's a difference, even if you can't see it right now. You have no idea what you're doing, he said, and his voice had dropped, gone low and strange in a way I hadn't heard before, more frightened than angry, now that the anger had nowhere left to go. The business, Laurel. It's not a good time for you to be doing this to me. I'm not doing anything to you. I'm doing something for me. I held his gaze through the screen. What's going on with the business? Nothing, he said too fast. The same careful nothing from the porch 2 mornings ago. And I understood. I'd found another yellowed leaf on a plant I was only just beginning to realize was in far worse trouble than I knew. You'll regret this, he said, instead of answering, and turned and walked back down the porch steps toward his truck. And something about the set of his shoulders when he said it wasn't a threat exactly, more like a man saying something true about himself and mistaking it for a warning about me. I watched his taillights disappear down the street for the second night in a row, and this time I didn't cry. I stood at the screen door a long while after he'd gone, turning over the look on his face when the key hadn't caught, the particular lost, undone quality of it, and some old tenderness in me ached even through the anger, the way a bone aches at the sight of a break long, after the break itself has stopped. Being the worst part, my phone buzzed on the counter behind me. Zora heard. Something about Marin today from a florist client, who does the flowers for half this town's therapists' offices. You're not going to like it. Call me. I stood in my quiet kitchen in my newly locked house and felt the calm I'd built all afternoon start. Very quietly, to crack, I looked down at the new keys on my ring, still bright and unscratched, not yet worn smooth by my thumb the way the old ones had been. Tomorrow, I would call Zora back and hear whatever it was she didn't want to say over text. Tonight, for just a few more hours, I let myself stand in my own kitchen in my own house and not know yet. And some part of me understood even then that this was the last quiet night I was going to get for a long while. Chapter 6. Everyone has a mother. Marilyn showed up at my studio the next morning, still in her church clothes, though it was a Tuesday, which told me she'd dressed carefully for this conversation, the way she dressed for funerals and difficult doctor's appointments. I'm not here to take sides, she said, before I'd even gotten her seated. I want that said plainly, because I imagine you're braced for me to walk in here and defend my son, and I understand why you'd think that. I wasn't sure what to expect, I admitted. Well, she folded her hands in her lap, an old habit from a lifetime of church pews. I raised that boy. I know exactly what he's capable of, the good and the sorry, and I'll tell you the truth, Laurel. What he said to you in that yard, Shay told me every word of it, was cruel. I didn't raise him to talk to a woman that way, and I told him so myself. Not an hour after it happened, I hadn't expected that, and something in my chest loosened slightly, hearing it. But I want you to understand something about the Kearneys too, she went on, because I don't think anybody's told you the whole of it. Merle and Marin's daddy grew up 2 houses apart, went through the war together, stood up at each other's weddings. When Marin's mama got sick and that family had to move for her treatment, it about broke Merle's heart, same as it broke Holt's, losing that girl out of our lives. Grief doesn't always travel in straight lines, honey. Sometimes it goes looking for the last place it remembers feeling whole, even when that place isn't safe to stand in anymore. I understand grief, Marilyn. I buried my grandmother. I know it doesn't behave. I know you do. She reached over and covered my hand with hers, papery and warm. I'm not asking you to forgive him. That's not mine to ask. I'm only telling you because I think you deserve the whole picture and not just the ugly corner of it, that my son isn't chasing a woman. He's chasing the last version of himself that didn't know what it felt like to lose his daddy. Doesn't make it right. Might help you understand it, though, when the time comes that you need to decide what you're deciding. She left not long after, and I sat at my drafting table for a long while without drawing anything, turning her words over like stones in my palm, weighing how much comfort I was allowed to take from an explanation that still didn't excuse a single thing that had been said in that yard. Zora watched me from across the studio for a while before she finally spoke. "You look like you're trying to decide whether to forgive him," she said. "I'm trying to decide whether understanding him is the same thing as forgiving him. I don't think it is. I just don't know yet what to do with the understanding. You don't have to do anything with it today." She came and sat on the edge of my table, the way she did when she wanted to make sure I actually heard her. Understanding a man's pain doesn't obligate you to hand him your whole life to manage it in. Those are two separate rooms, Laurel. You're allowed to stand in one without unlocking the door to the other. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, long after Zora had gone home, the two separate rooms of it sitting sensibly in my mind, even while the rest of me still felt like a house with every door thrown open at once. I called my mother that evening from the porch, the same porch, and told her about Marilyn's visit. "People can be more than one true thing at once," Nadine said, when I'd finished. "Holt can be a grieving son and a man who hurt you on purpose in the same breath. Understanding where cruelty comes from doesn't obligate you to keep standing in front of it." She was quiet a moment. "Your father wasn't cruel, God rest him, but he went through a stretch after his own mother passed where he wasn't easy to live with either. I gave him room. I also told him plainly there were things I would not carry for him. Both things were true at once. You're allowed both things too." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. The Willow Run Park Committee met that Thursday at the old freight depot down by the river, a beautiful brick building the city had converted into a community space. And I arrived early with my boards under my arm, nerves humming under my ribs, the way they always did before a big presentation. I hadn't expected to see a familiar face among the other bidders and consultants milling near the coffee station. But there he was, Grady Marchetti, who owned Ember and Root over on the North Shore. The restaurant whose patio garden I'd designed 2 summers back, a long, unhurried project full of good conversation and better food that had turned into an easy, comfortable friendship I valued more than I usually admitted out loud. "They roped you into this too," he said, handing me a coffee before I even asked, because he remembered, the way he remembered most small things about people, that I took it black. "The city wants a demonstration kitchen garden built into the park plan. Figured they'd want a chef's opinion on what actually grows well next to a grill." I glanced at his boards, propped against the wall, sketches of raised beds and an open-air cooking pavilion. "Looks like we might be competing for the same 4 acres. Looks like we might be a package deal, if you're willing." He said it easily, no weight to it, just a practical man noticing a practical solution. "Your planting plan, my kitchen concept, might make us stronger pitch together than apart." We ended up presenting side by side that afternoon, my sketches of native grasses and shaded paths bleeding naturally into his plan for a garden classroom where local kids could learn to cook what they grew. And watching him talk about food in front of that committee, patient and specific and entirely unshowy about his own expertise, I felt something in my chest ease for the first time in days. Not romance, nothing so simple as that yet. Just the plain relief of being near a person who wasn't asking anything complicated of me. He credited my planting plan twice during his own presentation, unprompted. The kind of small generosity that told me more about a man's character than an hour of conversation ever could. "You look tired," he said afterward, walking me out to my car, and there was none of Shay's careful worry in it. None of Zora's fierce protectiveness, just a simple, unhurried observation from a man who had no stake in my answer either way. "Long few weeks. You don't have to tell me anything." He leaned against my car door, in no rush at all, But if you ever want to sit somewhere that isn't your kitchen table and eat something you didn't have to cook yourself, the restaurant's always got a seat with your name on it. No agenda. I make a decent living feeding people who are having a hard week. I told him I might take him up on that, and I meant it. And I drove home, turning over how strange it was that the easiest conversation I'd had in 2 weeks had happened with a man I had no history with at all. No wreckage between us, nothing to forgive or explain. My phone rang just as I pulled into the driveway. Zora, finally, the call I'd been half dreading since her text 2 nights before. I didn't want to say it over text, she said, no preamble. Marin's been asking around about you. Not ugly from what I heard. My client said she seemed genuinely torn up about it. Actually asked whether you two had ever met. Said she wanted to talk to you directly, instead of leaving it all tangled up in what Holt might or might not be telling either of you. I sat in my driveway with the engine off, watching the porch light I'd left burning out of habit, even though there was no one left to come home to it. She wants to talk to me? That's what I heard. Zora's voice softened. You don't have to say yes, Laurel. But I think you're going to want to hear whatever she's got to say. I think there's more to this than a text at 7 in the morning. I sat there a long moment after we hung up, keys still in my hand, and felt the ground under this whole story shift again. The way it kept shifting every time I thought I'd finally found solid footing. Chapter 7, 2 women, 1 grief. I almost cancelled twice that morning. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, telling myself I didn't owe this woman an hour of my life, that whatever she had to say could be said in a text or not said at all. But some part of me, the same part that had spent a whole night writing dates on a legal pad, understood that I would not be able to move forward in either direction, back toward my marriage or away from it, without hearing this for myself in her own voice. Instead of second-hand through Zora's florist client or Shay's guilty apology, we met at a coffee shop on the North Shore, neutral ground, a place neither of us had any history with, which I recognized even as I walked in was Marin's doing and not an accident. She was already seated when I arrived, a woman with dark hair going grey at the part and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time learning to sit quietly with hard things. Thank you for coming, she said, standing halfway before deciding against it, unsure whether we were the kind of women who shook hands. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. I sat across from her. Up close, she didn't look like a threat. She looked tired, the specific tired of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, without ever quite setting it down in front of the right person. I'm not here to fight with you, if that's what you're braced for. I'm not braced for a fight. I think I've been braced for this conversation for 2 months and just didn't have the nerve to start it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I want to say the true thing first, before either of us decides what kind of conversation this is. Nothing happened between me and Holt. Not the way you're probably imagining. We talked, we ate a few dinners. I'd let him cry in a parking lot once over his daddy, and he let me cry in the same parking lot 2 weeks later over my mother. That's the whole of it. I know that's not nothing. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's nothing. It's not nothing, I agreed. Even if it's not what I feared, it's still not nothing. No, she looked down at her coffee. It's not. She told me the rest of it slowly, in pieces, the way people tell you things they've never said out loud before. Her mother had died 14 months ago after a long fight with cancer. The kind of long fight that hollows out everyone standing near it. And her marriage, already thin before that, hadn't survived the grief on top of it. She had nowhere left that felt like home by the time Merle's funeral came, 8 months back now. And coming home for it had put her back in the same room as the one family who'd known her mother, known her whole life before Ohio, before any of it. Holt was the only person at that funeral who didn't ask me how I was doing in that voice people use, she said. You know the voice, the careful one. He just handed me a plate of food and sat down next to me and didn't say anything at all for 20 minutes. And it was the first time in over a year I didn't feel like I had to perform being okay for somebody. That's exactly what he did for me, I said quietly, the week we buried my grandmother. Word for word, almost. Something moved across her face, surprise and then something sadder underneath it. I didn't know that. I don't imagine he told you much about me at all. He told me you were strong. She said it like an accusation against herself, not against me. He said it like it was a compliment, and I think he meant it as one. But I heard it, and I understood exactly what he was really telling me, which was that he didn't think you needed him the way I did. That's not fair to you. I want you to know I knew that even while it was happening, and I let it happen anyway because I was drowning, and he was the only hand in the water. You could have let go of the hand. I said, not the second you knew whose it was. I could have. She met my eyes then, and there wasn't any defensiveness left in her face, just plain, unhappy honesty. I didn't, because I'm not as good a person as I'd like to believe I am, and because grief makes you selfish in ways you don't recognize until you're standing outside yourself, looking back at what you did. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think that's mine to ask for. I just didn't want you carrying this without knowing I see it clearly now, for what it was. I've already told him it's done. I told him last week. How did he take that? Badly, a small, humorless laugh. I think some part of him needed me to be the thing keeping him from having to look at whatever else is going on in his life. When I told him I couldn't do that anymore, he didn't ask me to stay. He just went very quiet, the way I imagine he goes quiet with you. And I understood then that it was never really about me at all. I was just easier to sit with than whatever he's actually avoiding. We sat with that for a while, two women who had never wanted to know each other this well. Both of us worn thin by the same man's grief, in different rooms of the same story. Can I tell you something that might not be my place to say? She asked as I was gathering my things to go. Go ahead, he's not chasing me. Not really. I don't think he was ever really chasing me. I think he's been running from something a lot bigger than either of us since his daddy died. And I just happened to be standing somewhere that felt like the last safe place before he had to face it. I don't know what that something is. But whatever it is, Laurel, I don't think you've seen the worst of it yet. She said it gently, not as a threat, more like a woman passing along a warning she wished somebody had given her. I think there's more he hasn't told either of us. I thought about that the whole drive home, her words sitting strange and cold in my chest, more unsettling somehow than anything I'd imagined walking into that coffee shop. I'd braced myself for jealousy, for anger, for the particular ugliness of confronting the other woman. I hadn't braced myself for a warning, or for how much I would end up believing the woman who delivered it. I thought, too, about how strange grief made everybody in this story, myself included. Marin had reached for a man who wasn't hers because her own hands were empty. Holt had reached for the last version of his life that didn't include a father-shaped hole in it. And I had spent 8 months reaching for patience, for understanding, for every gentle explanation I could find that didn't require me to ask the one question that mattered most, which was simply, what else are you not telling me? I passed the old freight depot where I'd met Grady 2 weeks earlier. Its windows lit gold in the late afternoon sun, and some small, tired part of me wished I were headed there instead, toward a conversation that wouldn't cost me anything. My phone rang just as I crossed the river, an unfamiliar number with a local area code, and I almost let it go to voicemail before something made me answer. Mrs. Chastain, this is Deborah with First Ridge Bank, following up on the loan application. I just need to confirm a few details on your end before we can move forward with the joint application review. The light turned green behind me. A car honked. I didn't move. I'm sorry, I said. My own voice sounded strange to me, very far away, like it belonged to someone standing on the riverbank watching me sit there. What joint application? The commercial line of credit for Chastain and Sons, the woman said, entirely pleasant, entirely unaware that she'd just handed me a live wire. Your husband listed you as co-applicant back in April. I just have a few identity verification questions before we can finalize the underwriting. April, 2 months ago. Long before any of this had a name. I need to call you back, I said, and hung up before she could answer. And sat there on the bridge, with my hands shaking on the wheel, while the car behind me honked again. And I understood, with a slow, sick certainty, that whatever Marine had tried to warn me about was only just beginning to show itself. Chapter 8. The Paper That Broke Me. I didn't call Deborah back that night. I called Holt instead and told him in a voice I barely recognized as my own that he needed to meet me at the house in an hour. And something in the way I said it must have carried the whole weight of what I now knew, because he didn't argue, and he didn't ask why. I spent that hour at the kitchen table with my laptop, doing the thing I should have done 2 months ago, going back through every account, every statement, every scrap of paper that touched our shared finances, and what I found, piece by piece, made the bank loan feel almost like the smallest part of it. Chastain & Sons had lost its biggest commercial contract in February, a shopping centre build-out that had fallen through when the developer backed out, and Holt had never once mentioned it to me. I read through email after email between him and his foreman, a man named Curtis, who'd worked for Merle for 20 years, watching the language shift over 3 months from cautious optimism to something closer to panic. In March, he'd missed a payroll cycle for 2 weeks and covered it with a personal line of credit he'd opened without my knowledge. Using our marriage, our joint tax returns from years past, my name on paperwork I had never signed and never seen. By the time I reached April, my hands weren't steady anymore. In April, when that credit line filled up, he'd walked into First Ridge Bank and applied for a much larger commercial loan. And somewhere in that application, in a box asking for a co-applicant with strong personal credit, he had typed my name and my social security number, both of which he knew by heart from a decade of joint filings, and simply hoped, I imagine, that he could fix everything before I ever had to find out. He was still in his work clothes when he came through the door, sawdust on his boots, and I watched him take in the sight of me at the kitchen table, with 3 months of statements spread out in front of me like a crime scene, and I watched every last excuse die on his face before he'd said a single word. "How long were you going to let this go on?" I said. "Before you told me my name was on a loan application I never signed? I was going to pay it off before it ever came due. I swear to you, Laurel, I had a plan. You had a plan to use my credit without asking me. That's not a plan, Holt. That's a lie with a due date." He sat down across from me, heavily, like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. "The business is dying," he said, and it was the first time in 8 months I'd heard him say it plainly, without softening it into something smaller. "It's been dying since February. I lost the Riverside contract, and I never told you, because telling you meant admitting I couldn't hold up the one thing Daddy left me, the one thing I was supposed to be able to carry. And I have never in my life felt like more of a failure than I did the day I understood I was about to lose everything he built. So you decided to risk my credit instead of telling your wife the truth. I decided I could fix it before you ever had to know it was broken." His voice cracked on the last word. "That's what my daddy taught me, Laurel. You don't bring your family your problems until you've already solved them. You carry it yourself. That's what a man does. A man doesn't forge his wife's name onto a loan application and call it carrying something," I said, and my own voice had gone very quiet, very still, the stillness I recognized now as the place I went right before the worst of the pain arrived. "You didn't carry this, Holt, you hid it. There's a difference, and I think you know the difference, and I think you chose to hide it anyway because some part of you would rather lose me than admit you needed help." He didn't argue with that. He put his face in his hands instead, and when he spoke again, his voice was muffled and small, nothing like the man who had stood in this yard 2 weeks ago telling me I didn't own him. "I don't know how to ask for help. I never have. I watched my daddy run that business for 30 years, without ever once asking anybody for anything. And I thought that was strength, and now I understand it just meant none of us ever learned how. And Marin was easy," he said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said to me in weeks. "Marin didn't need anything from me. She didn't need me to fix a business or hold up a family name or be anybody's rock. I could just sit next to her and be exactly as broken as I actually was. And that was the only place in my whole life, for 8 months, where I didn't feel like I was failing somebody. It was never about loving her instead of you, Laurel. It was about needing somewhere I didn't have to be strong. And I found that somewhere in the wrong person's company, and I am so sorry, I am so sorry. I don't know how to make you understand how sorry I am. I believed him. That was the strange, terrible part of that whole conversation. I believed every word of it, believed the grief underneath the lie, believed that he had never set out to hurt me on purpose. And none of that belief changed the fact that I had spent 8 months slowly disappearing, inside a marriage where my own husband would rather forge my name than... Trust me with the truth. I need you to hear something, I said. And I need you to hear it without arguing with me. Because I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. I love the man who built me an arbor. I loved him for years, and some part of me is always going to love him. But I cannot stay married to a man who thinks protecting me means lying to me. That's not protection, Holt. That's just a different kind of abandonment dressed up nicer. What are you saying? I'm saying I need a real separation, not a cooling-off period. Not you staying at your mother's until the dust settles. I'm calling an attorney tomorrow, and I need you to let me do that without a fight. Because I have given you every ounce of grace I have left in me. And there isn't any more where that came from. He didn't fight me. That surprised me more than anything else that whole night. I'd braced for anger, for the same cruelty that had stood in the yard 2 weeks ago. And instead I watched something in him simply give way. Like a wall that had been holding back a flood for months, finally admitting it couldn't hold anymore. "Okay," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "Okay, Laurel." He left that night without another word, and I sat alone at the kitchen table long after his taillights had disappeared. The loan statements still spread out in front of me under the kitchen light, and I did not cry the way I had the first night in the yard. I sat very still instead, in the wreckage of 8 months I hadn't fully understood the shape of until that evening. And I let myself grieve the marriage I'd actually had, the real one, honest about its own dishonesty for the first time. The next morning I called Vera Petrakis, a family law attorney. A client had recommended 2 years back for an entirely different reason. Back when this house had been nothing more complicated than a place I loved. Her office was above a bakery on Fraser Avenue, and the whole waiting room smelled like cinnamon, which struck me as almost cruelly gentle for a place where people came to end things. I sat in that waiting room at 9 o'clock, a folder of loan statements and bank records in my lap, and I thought about how strange it was that I felt no anger at all in that moment, only a vast, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes after you've carried something heavy for a very long way and finally set it down. My hand trembled slightly around the pen I'd need in a few minutes to sign my own name to the first page of ending my marriage, and I thought, absurdly, of Fern's roses cut back hard in the cold, waiting on faith alone for a spring that hadn't shown itself yet. The receptionist called my name. I picked up the pen. Chapter 9, What Growing Back Looks Like. The separation papers were filed on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, the whole quiet machinery of ending a marriage had begun turning around me, slow and grinding and far less dramatic than I'd imagined it would be. There was no courtroom. There was no audience. There was only paperwork and silence and the strange, ordinary work of learning to live in a house that was fully, finally, only mine. Vera handled the loan situation first, since it carried the most immediate risk. A formal letter to First Ridge Bank, withdrawing my name from the application, my own credit report flagged and monitored, a paper trail of my own now, careful and precise, proving I had never authorized what had been done in my name. Deborah from the bank called twice more, apologetic once she understood the situation, and the loan itself was eventually restructured without me attached to it at all. Holt securing a smaller line of credit against the company's remaining equipment instead. You handled that well. Vera told me the second week, closing a folder across her desk. Most people in your position want to burn the whole thing down out of spite. You just wanted the danger removed from your own name and nothing more than that. That's not weakness, whatever anybody tells you. That's precision. I didn't feel precise. I felt like a woman, moving through her own life one careful step at a time, testing each board before she put her full weight on it, the way you'd cross a porch you weren't sure would hold. But I appreciated her saying it anyway. I heard about the rest of it in pieces. The way you hear about a fire after you've already left the building. From Shay mostly, who called every week or two now, careful and a little guilty. Like she was trying to make up for the dinner where she'd first told me the truth, by making sure I never again learned anything important second-hand. Holt had started seeing a grief counselor, a man named Dr. Okonkwo, who Marilyn had found through her church, and he'd been going every week without missing one, which Shay told me with the particular pride of a sister watching her brother do something hard and necessary for the first time in his adult life. He'd sat his mother and sister down and told them the whole truth about the business, the lost contract, the missed payroll, the loan, all of it. No more carrying it alone in the dark. He'd sold 2 of the company's older trucks and let go of an office manager position they didn't actually need. Hard, unglamorous decisions that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. And Chastain & Sons was smaller now, leaner, but it was still standing, still his, still built on something closer to honesty than it had been in a year. Marin had moved to Chattanooga's outskirts for a few weeks, and then, quietly, back to Ohio entirely, taking a position at a hospital near where her mother was buried. Shay told me she'd stopped by the house before she left, dropped off a small potted fern on the porch with no note attached, which felt, when I heard about it, less like an apology and more like an acknowledgement, one woman to another, of a debt that could never actually be repaid in words. The letter came in early September, 3 weeks into the separation, no warning. Just an envelope in my mailbox in Holt's handwriting. The same careful block print he used for job estimates. Laurel, I'm not asking you to read this and change your mind. I know better now than to ask you for anything you haven't already decided to give me. I just needed you to have this in writing, because I think some part of you deserves to see, in my own hand, everything I'm finally able to say. You were right about all of it. The lying, the way I hid the business instead of trusting you with it. The way I used Marin's grief as a place to hide from my own, instead of doing the harder work of grieving in front of the person who actually loved me enough to sit with it. I've spent 8 months in Dr. Okonkwo's office learning that my daddy taught me plenty about how to build a wall and nothing at all about how to ask for help standing behind one. And I am only now slowly unlearning that. I don't expect you back. I want to be clear that this letter isn't that. I just wanted you to know that whatever I ruined it because I was drowning and too proud to say so. Not because you ever once failed to be exactly the wife I promised to deserve and didn't. You gave me 4 good years and a house full of grace I didn't earn. I'm sorry it took losing you to teach me how to be worth it. I hope Willow Run Park is everything you've dreamed it into being. I always did think you were the most talented person I ever met. Even on the days I was too much of a coward to say it out loud. Holty read it twice, sitting on the porch step, and I cried. But it wasn't the same crying as the night in the yard. It was quieter, more like grief finally finding its proper shape. The grief of a marriage that had been real and good for a long time before it became something else. And I let myself feel all of it without rushing past any part. 2 days later, the city called. Fern and Stone had won the Willow Run Park commission. My design paired with Grady's kitchen garden concept exactly as we'd pitched it. 4 acres of riverbank that would carry my grandmother's name into a part of this city I'd never touched before. I called Zora first, and we screamed into the phone like we were 22 again. And then, almost without deciding to, I called Grady. I heard, he said, before I could even get the words out. Half the North Shore heard. I may have told a few people before it was officially official. Buy me dinner to celebrate? I own a restaurant, Laurel. I could just feed you for free. Buy me dinner anyway, I said, and he laughed, warm and unhurried. and told me to come by at 7. We sat on the patio I'd designed for him 2 summers back, string lights strung through the crepe myrtles, and we didn't talk about Holt at all, not once, which felt less like avoidance and more like relief. 2 people simply enjoying each other's company without either of us performing anything for the other. "Can I say something that isn't my business yet?" he asked over the last of the wine. "You can say it. I'm not in any hurry. Whatever this is, whatever it might become someday, I'm not going to be the man who shows up while you're still standing in the wreckage and asks you to build something new before you've even finished grieving the old thing. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere either. There's no clock running on this as far as I'm concerned." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely curious. Most people would want an answer sooner rather than later, because I watched my own parents rush a second marriage each, both of them, right after their divorce. And both times it was a disaster built on nothing but relief that somebody wanted them. He turned his glass slowly on the table. "I decided a long time ago I'd rather wait for something real than settle for something fast." "You're worth waiting for properly, Laurel. I've got no interest in being anybody's rebound. And I don't think you've got any interest in being anybody's rescue, either." I didn't have an answer for that except gratitude, and I let it sit there between us, unhurried. Exactly as he'd offered it. The final papers were ready to sign on the 2nd Friday of October. Vera called that morning to confirm the time, and I stood in my kitchen afterward, looking out at the garden Fern had planted and I had kept alive, at the new locks on doors that had never once needed to be tested again after that first hard week. And I understood that tomorrow I would walk into that office and sign the last page of a marriage that had, in its own broken way, taught me more about my own strength than any easy love ever could have. I called my mother that evening, mostly just to hear her voice. "You sound steady," Nadine said, after I'd told her the time of tomorrow's appointment. "I feel steady." "I didn't expect that. That's because you did the hard part already, honey. Signing your name tomorrow is just paperwork catching up to a decision your heart already made weeks ago, standing in that yard." She was quiet a moment. "Your grandmother would be proud of you. I hope you know that." "I know it," I said, and found, a little to my own surprise, that I actually did. Tonight, I just wanted to breathe. Chapter 10, Bloom Season. Spring came late to Chattanooga that year. But when it came all at once, the way it always does in the mountains. Dogwoods and redbuds bursting open overnight, like the whole city had been holding its breath since February. I stood at the edge of Willow Run Park on the morning of its opening, watching the first families wander down the paths Zora and I had designed, kids chasing each other around the willow grove near the river's edge, and Grady's outdoor kitchen already filling the air with wood smoke and rosemary. The mayor said a few words nobody really listened to. A local news crew interviewed an elderly man who remembered when this stretch of riverbank had been nothing but scrub and old rail ties, and told the camera, with real feeling, that he'd never imagined living long enough to see it become somewhere his great-grandchildren would want to play. A small bronze plaque near the entrance read, "Simply in memory of Fern Brennan, who taught a city to garden 1 yard at a time," and I stood in front of it longer than I meant to, letting myself feel the particular ache of a joy that has grief folded quietly inside it. The divorce had been finalized in October, 6 months back now, and it had been, in the end, almost anticlimactic. A conference room, 2 lawyers, a stack of papers, and Holt across the table from me, looking older than his years, but steadier than I'd seen him in over a year. We hadn't fought over the house because there had never been anything to fight about. It had only ever been mine. We'd split what needed splitting, quietly, fairly, and when it was over, he'd walked me to my car in the parking lot. An oddly gentle courtesy from a man I was no longer married to. "I hope you're happy," he'd said. I mean that plainly. Not as something people say. I actually hope it. I hope the same for you. I'd told him and found that I meant it too. which surprised me more than almost anything else in that whole long year. I saw him now only in passing. At Marilyn's for the occasional holiday, I still couldn't quite bring myself to give up, since she'd made it clear I would always have a chair at her table, regardless of what her son and I were to each other. He'd sold Chastain and Son's old office building and moved the whole operation into a smaller shop off Rossville Boulevard, leaner, honest, still standing. Shay told me he still went to Dr. Okonkwo every week. She told me, too, gently, that he'd started seeing someone new this spring, a hospice nurse named Renata he'd met through his mother's church, and that he seemed, for the first time since his father died, like a man who had finally stopped drowning long enough to learn how to swim. I was glad for him. I want that understood plainly, the way he'd once wanted his own hope for me understood. Grief had made him cruel for a season, and cruelty had cost him the best thing he'd built before the business ever came apart. But somewhere in the wreckage he had also become, slowly, a better man than the one who'd stood in my yard and told me I didn't own him. I got to walk away with that truth intact. Not every story gets to end that cleanly, and I never took it for granted. Fern and Stone had grown that spring too. A second hire, a waiting list 6 months deep. My grandmother's name now attached to public spaces all over a city she'd once tended, one modest yard at a time. I thought about her constantly in that garden, in every garden. The particular way she used to kneel in the dirt beside me and talk about pruning like it was theology. Zora found me at the edge of the willow grove, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and passed me one without asking. "You did this," she said, nodding out at the whole bright, blooming park. "We did this. Fine, we did this." She bumped her shoulder against mine. "You know what I keep thinking about? That morning you texted me at 6:40 asking if I'd ever heard of somebody named Marin. You sounded so small that morning, Laurel. I don't think you sound small anymore." I didn't. And I hadn't, not in a long time. Grady found me not long after. An apron still tied around his waist, flour dusted on one forearm, and he didn't say anything at all at first. Just stood beside me looking out at the park the way you look at something you helped build, with your own 2 hands. "Congratulations." "Laurel Brennan," he said finally. "Congratulations to you too." "Grady Marchetti." He glanced sideways at me, something easy and unhurried in his face. The same patience he'd offered me on his restaurant patio all those months ago. "You know, it's been a while now, since I made you that offer about the clock not running on anything. It has been. I'm not asking you to say anything today. Big day, lots of witnesses, terrible timing for a man to make his case." He smiled. "I'm just saying, whenever you're ready, and only whenever, no sooner, I'd like to take you somewhere that isn't a work event. Just the 2 of us. No park committee. No wine list I picked because I own the restaurant it came from." I looked at him for a long moment, this steady, patient man who had never once asked me to be anything other than exactly as healed as I actually was, and I found, standing there in the middle of a garden that carried my grandmother's name into a whole city's future, that I was finally quietly ready. "I'd like that," I said. "Thursday?" "Thursday," he agreed, and his smile then was the kind that made the whole bright morning feel a little brighter still. I walked home that evening the long way, past the river, past the Walnut Street Bridge where I'd once sat frozen in my car with a bank officer's voice unraveling my whole life, and I let myself feel, all at once, everything that stretch of road had carried me through. My porch light was on when I got there, the same one I'd left burning out of habit for years, except now I understood it wasn't burning for anybody's return. It was burning because it was my porch, my light, my house, and I got to decide every single evening exactly who I was, welcoming home. I let myself in with the key I'd had cut myself, the lock I'd chosen myself, and stood a moment in my own front hall, in the quiet, solid center of a life I had built back up with my own 2 hands. The strongest locks, I've come to understand, were never really the ones on the doors. The ones that mattered most were the quieter kind, the kind you build inside yourself, one honest boundary at a time until you finally know all the way down to the roots, exactly what you're worth, and exactly who deserves a key, what this story teaches us. Grief does not excuse cruelty. A person can be genuinely hurting and still be responsible for the wounds they cause someone else. Both things are true at once. And love doesn't require you to pretend otherwise. A boundary is not a punishment. Laurel never set out to end her marriage by changing those locks. She set out to stop disappearing inside it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is simply refuse to keep shrinking. Understanding someone's pain is not the same as excusing what they did with it. You are allowed to hold compassion for a person's story and still choose not to keep living inside the damage of it. Real love waits without keeping score. Grady never once asked Laurel to heal faster than she was able to. The people worth keeping in your life are the ones who let your timeline be your own. What's legally, spiritually, and rightfully yours does not require anyone else's permission to protect. Laurel's house, her business, her name, she guarded every one of them, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. The strongest thing a woman can build is not a marriage that looks perfect from the outside. It's a life so honestly rooted that no matter what storm comes through, she knows exactly how to stand back up in it. Until next time. Queen flowers, keep your roots deep, keep your locks strong, and keep believing that your bloom season is still coming. Mr. Peter.